Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
It's my pleasure to be on.
We come to the end of our series on concubines in Islam. And thank you for that, Dr. Shabir. I've learned a lot. The question that we first began with was a question from a viewer who said, how is it possible that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had a concubine or concubines? How is that moral? So the person was asking about the morality of it. And there are other questions that we could ask too about the Quran, which mentions concubines. How is that moral in itself? We're supposed to follow this book, but it's talking about concubines, right? So Dr. Shabir, we've tried to answer some of the questions that arose out of that. And maybe you want to comment on that,
yes.
How far we've gone.
Yes, it is important for our viewers to see the progression of this whole discussion and to recall that it actually began with this question. So it's not like we're being revisionist, out of our own whims or fancies, but we're dealing with a real problem in that for many Muslims, they come across the mention in the Quran of the right-hand possession, and they're asking, what is this? And to them, it's very strange. So we're not talking about pleasing non-Muslims here. We're talking about helping Muslims to understand their own faith. And for many Muslims, when they come across mention that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had a concubine, which is widely mentioned in Islamic tradition, here too, they find it difficult to accept, because a Muslim has been taught that there are certain activities which can only take place within a marriage, and outside of the marriage, this would be haram, prohibited. And then when they hear that the Prophet, peace be upon him, had such a person that he was related to in an intimate way, but he was not married to her, this is another way of having intimate relations with one's concubine, they find it difficult to accept. So how do we deal with that? And we have looked at apologetic responses from Muslims. And while we respect that much of what the apologists say are things that we agree with, and we would say that too. But we also showed the inadequacy of their final conclusion. Like usually they conclude by saying, okay, the Quran says so, that it's allowed.
It's not that bad.
And so it can be bad, because based on divine command theory, God says it, so it must be right. And then they point out that, okay, the reports in Islamic tradition show that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had a concubine, so it can't be bad because he was the moral example for all time. So that's, you might say, a very a hardcore type of apologetic response. A softer response may be one that looks at the history and says, well, the circumstances were like that. And the Muslim community could not have done much different at that time. Historical circumstances were like that. If the enemies caught our people at the end of a battle, they would take our people as captives, and they would use our women as their concubines. That was the reality, a harsh reality of the ancient world. And naturally, Muslims had the same privilege to even the score by making war not attractive to the non-Muslims. It's not like, they come, they attack us, steal our women, but if we get victory, we don't have the right to take their women. So it has to be like a deterrent in a way. That's the harshness of war, but it works for both sides. So these were some of the circumstances that one can point to and say, okay, this is why it continued. So the softer apologetic response would say that, it had to be accepted at the time. There's not much the Muslims could have done about that. Moreover, once you have taken captives of war and they're in your society, either you put them in prison, like an ancient form of Guantanamo Bay or something like this, or since there was no prison in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in that Medinan society of the first Muslim generation, the natural thing for them to do was to distribute the captives of war as domestic servants. So the domestic servants were there, and women were particularly vulnerable in that situation if they were left unmarried. And so while they could be married off to persons within the society, if no one found them desirable enough to marry them, the lesser of the two evils here would have been for them to be a concubine to their master, rather than to be an unmarried woman in that society, in which case they might remain vulnerable to attacks. They might be seen to be easy targets, for men who do not. The Quran describes some men as men in whose hearts there is a disease. And apparently we have many of those, not only then, but even now.
So all those justifications are well and good. But then when you think about God being just, right? How could this just God completely disregard these women who were being taken advantage of and not even being afforded any consent, right? So that's the question that people still have.
Yes, and that's where we showed the inadequacy even of that softer response, that softer apologetic defense of the whole system suffers from this clear lack of addressing this particular deeper question. And I will add that it also suffers in another way, in that when we trace that historical situation, we say, okay, that's how it was then, it had to be accepted then. In what sense then are we saying that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is our example for all time to come? Mm-hmm. It means then that we must take the next step of saying that, okay, he did certain things in his time and place, which were very relevant to that time and place and would have been seen to be the best that could be done at that time. So he's known to have risen above the situation by picking the best things that could be picked and done and chosen at that time. But then to say that his choices are the choices that we have to make today, to the extent that someone might say, okay, well, this is a good system, it's better than every other system, let's just implement it today exactly as was implemented by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. I think that is a mistaken conclusion that arises from even that softer apologetic response. Mm-hmm. And now coming back to this deeper question, how could God allow this? So again, we have to say that was the historical situation in which God is steering that early Muslim community to bring out from that community the best that could be brought out. But with anything else, like the result you can achieve is often dependent on or linked to the type of materials that you're working with. So you want to carve soap, but the soap has to be of a sort of density and texture for you to be able to carve it and get, the desired result. You want to chisel ice and form nice ice sculptures, but the ice itself has to be of a certain thickness and strength. Otherwise, it will break under your chisel. And what you can do with the materials that you're working with is limited depending on the materials. When God wanted to reshape that community that came from what we call the Jahiliyyah, or the period of ignorance, and to bring them into a time of light and revelation, there are limitations. You're dealing with persons who had to be coaxed gradually. So if we think about the classic example of banning alcohol in the Muslim community, that had to be done gradually in stages. In the case of this concubinage issue, or concubinage, that also had to be done gradually. And Muslims tend to think, well, the way it was left at the end, that was the completion and that's the final product. But it could be that God intended that the Muslims will continue to be molded along the general lines which are already chalked out in the Quran, and that they themselves will see it fit to abolish slavery altogether, and by extension and implication, the practice of concubinage would also be abolished from Muslim society.
Mm-hmm. So you said it could be. What does that mean? Do you think that God intended for this to happen? Do you think that God would be pleased that the result is that we see concubinage as immoral?
Yes. I think God would be pleased that the world has abolished slavery in general and concubinage as a result of that. And for Muslims to embrace that, I think that would be the thing that will please God, rather than to think, well, okay, we can still do it today, and at least in theory.
Mm-hmm. And then if the circumstances are right.
If the circumstances are right, and then some groups like ISIS, for example, they think, okay, our circumstances are right, and we're just doing what the earliest Muslims did. and what the Quran seems to indicate by their misunderstanding of the Quran, though their misunderstanding is a very classical one. It's there in our classical books of interpretation of the Quran and our law books and all of that. So many will say that they are misinterpreting it for our present time, that it should not apply to our present time because the world has so changed and whatever. But the theory of how this would not apply to our present time, this is slightly lacking. And we have tried to explain in our series that the Quran does not need to be interpreted in a way that justifies or legitimates a man sleeping with his slave woman just by virtue of owning her, unless he marries her first, in which case she would be his wife. And looking closer at the Islamic tradition regarding Maria in particular, the Coptic woman who was said to have been a concubine of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we have shown that it is not necessary to take those reports as though they were authentic reports about the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and more likely, the Prophet, peace be upon him, had married her, and so she was a legitimate and completely a wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts, Dr. Shabir, and thank you for this very enlightening series.
You're welcome. I'm glad we have done it.
If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe. And please donate to support our work at QuranSpeaks.com.